participants for joining this session. So I propose that we start the session, as I think that we are now almost full house. So it is a real pleasure to open the second session of this webinar series jointly prepared by IOM Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa, and especially the Regional Data Hub and the Economic Research Forum. So as you know, this webinar series focuses on the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 on migrants and displaced persons in the Middle East and North Africa region. Yesterday, colleagues and myself held a very important and very interesting session on the impact of COVID-19 on mobile populations' health in the region. So the discussions have included a wide range of topics such as access to healthcare during the COVID-19 crisis, access to vaccination for migrants and displaced, also how to best raise awareness on the benefits of vaccination. So if you are interested in listening again, this session, the recording at the moment is on ERF's website, and the presentations from yesterday are also available online. And today our focus is on the economic impact of COVID-19 on mobile populations throughout the Middle East and North Africa region. So as you all know, the pandemic has been a considerable shock to the economies of the region, and in particular the fact that the global dimension of the crisis and the fact that it penetrated many aspects of populations' daily lives, including their ability to move, their ability to work, their ability to access some services as well, has been very much unprecedented. And as we will see in the presentations today, migrants and displaced persons in the region have paid to some extent a heavy tribute in this context. And they have experienced a wide range of negative economic effects of the pandemic because of lockdown and also the general contraction of economic systems. To some extent, a number of migrants and displaced persons have not been able to continue working, or they were constrained to working part-time only. Further than this, the owners of small and medium enterprises have been severely affected by negative effects of the pandemic. Some of them have been forced to dismiss some of their employees or to close their businesses. And also another negative effect of the pandemic has been the closure of borders, which created an impediment to individuals who wanted to send or receive remittances. And of course, migrants have been deeply affected by this. And despite all of these challenges, migrants and displaced populations have shown an incredible ability to adapt to the new situations, and they have adopted a range of strategies to cope with the effects of the disease. However, in some circumstances, the consequences of the pandemic have been dramatic, including increased debt, risks of evictions, dependency from informal sources of income, and increased risks of exploitation. So the speakers today will provide us with an overview of the key consequences of COVID-19 on migrants and displaced, and they will address a wide range of topics, such as the impact of COVID on small and medium enterprises, on remittances, but also the variations in mobile populations' levels of poverty. The interventions today will cover several countries, including Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, and Jordan also. And before giving the floor to our first speakers, I would like to mention that this session is recorded and it is broadcasted on ERF's YouTube channel. And also, if participants wish to ask any questions on the presentations, please feel free to do so in the Q&A section directly, or raise your hand in due course during the discussion, which will be held at the end of the session. Without further ado, and because we have a lot of presentations today, I would like to introduce my colleagues from IOM Iraq. So Mrs. Erin Neal and Mr. Diego Martin. who will conduct the first presentation of this panel, which focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on SMEs in Iraq. And their intervention will be commented by Professor Shahir Zaki, who is Associate Professor of Economics and the head of the French section at Cairo University. Erin and Diego, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and share this presentation. Okay. Great. All right, so as Joris mentioned, we will be presenting the findings of a study we did on the impact of COVID-19 on small and medium enterprises in Iraq. This was a panel study we did in partnership with 2 other UN agencies, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the International Trade Center. We did 4 rounds of data collection starting in June 2020 and ending June 2021. We started with almost 900 firms and ended up with just over 700 in the sample. And the analysis presented today is of the 716 firms that participated in the final round. The sample was taken from an existing IOM dataset of over 2,200 firms, and these were firms involved in previous market assessments done by IOM in locations affected by displacement. So this will be quite a boiled down summary of what the economy was facing going into COVID. Iraq was seeing a growth in GDP for the 2 years leading up to the first case of COVID. However, at the same time, oil prices had been decreasing since 2012, and this negatively affected the Iraqi economy overall, which is heavily dependent on oil. There were also ongoing and increasing social fragilities. Large protests started in October 2019 over corruption, unemployment, and public service provision. So this was the situation going into 2020. A global pandemic causes a unique and complex economic crisis in any country. What we saw countries around the world responding in different ways, attempting to pad their economies, especially in sectors most affected by the pandemic. So in Iraq, once the first case of COVID arrived and things started to shut down, the government did not have much space to stimulate the economy due to the economic and social fragilities that it had going on before. In 2020, we saw the Iraqi dinar being devalued. GDP experienced a negative growth of just under 12%. Unemployment rose 10%, and the economy experienced its worst contraction since 2003. Iraq implemented movement restrictions to try to slow the spread of COVID-19. Each governorate had, different set of restrictions. At the most, it was 304 days out of the study period where there was some sort of restriction, and at the very least, it was 36 days in the period that was observed and asked about, which was February 2020 to June 2021. Revenue decreased in the first few months of the pandemic by 67% on average among the firms in the study. And 1.5 years later, by the 4th round in June 2021, monthly revenue remained 37% below pre-COVID levels. And in terms of production, again, at the beginning, by the first round, almost all firms experienced a decrease in production. You can see 98% of them reported experiencing a decrease in production. And the proportion by which production decreased on average was 66%. And then by the second round in September or August 2020, until the end of the study, consistently about 3/4 of firms still experienced negative effects on their production, and the average proportion by which production decreased was about half. At the beginning of the pandemic, in terms of ways to cope with the financial challenges that firms faced with this sort of unprecedented event and challenge, firms opted to reduce salaries of some employees and also have some employees at home with either their full or reduced salary. And that trend decreased over time. Also, the trend of laying off employees started off as the other coping mechanisms. It was higher in the beginning, and then it started to fall over time. But interestingly, and a bit unexpectedly, the percentage of firms laying off employees increased again in the second year of the pandemic by June 2021, our fourth round of data collection. Job loss among women was higher in round one, with a 44% reduction in female employees between February and June 2020, compared to a reduction of 34% of male employees. And by round four in June 2021, when comparing male and female employee numbers to those before the pandemic, female job loss was still 8% higher than male job loss. So in other words, females continued to face higher rates of job loss than their male coworkers, even 1.5 years into the pandemic in June 2021.
Thank you, Erin. So I will take it from here. So with the available databases, we can also break down the analysis by sector. So overall, in table A, we see a decline in employment between the pre-COVID-19 levels and the first round in June 1, that will be here. But a recovery in round 4 in May 2021. This is for all the sectors. However, education and technology had the highest decline, followed by small hotels. That is what we call hospitality, and also food and agriculture. These three sectors are the ones that saw the highest decline in the number of employees on average. And then in table 9, we asked the small and medium firms for the number of employees they laid off permanently. And there we found that the small hotels, again, that this category that we call hospitality, had the greatest decline in June 2020, which is round 1. But manufacturing and textile had the highest reduction in employment in round 4. Next slide, please. Erin, could you please move it to the next slide?
Yes, I'm trying.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay, there we go.
Sorry about that. So then for revenues, we also have information for revenues and sales, and also divided by sectors. So we have a reduction. We found a reduction in all the sectors in April 2020. However, the economy is slightly recovering, and small firms in hospitality and other sectors actually report an increase in the average revenue. However, we still see that the rest of the sectors have negative numbers, which means that these sectors can still not get the levels of revenues that they have before the pandemic started. Next slide. And then for production, so here, instead of breaking down the information by sector, what we do is to break it down by governorates, kind of see the difference variation by location in Iraq. And here in round 1, we see that all the firms in our sample reported a decrease in production. And still in the last round, we still see that almost all the firms in some governorates, such as Erbil and Nissan, these firms reported a reduce in production. And overall, the reduction in production is about 60% in column 1. That will be in round 1, and it's about 48% for in the last column when we compare December 2020 and June 2021. Next slide. And also what we do is to run a simple model of linear correlations to see how different characteristics that we have can explain the revenue growth comparing February 2020 with May 2020 in column 1, and then we compare each of the revenues that we have with the levels that we have before the pandemic. That will be the dependent variable. So in panel A, we have revenue growth, and in panel B, we have employment growth. And the independent variable that we focus is the number of days the governorate where a firm is located was under lockdown or curfews, As Erin was saying, we have some variation there that we exploit for this model. And what we see is a reduction of the revenue growth in those places with more lockdowns. And that's something that we were expecting. And also in this model, we control for some characteristics that we have for the firms, such as having a woman as a top manager, the manager is less than 35 years old, and so on. And also what we want to see here is if it is actually to see this differential in those locations with more lockdowns than without lockdowns. And we actually found that there is a decline in this, at least in these two dependent variables. Next slide.
So to recap some of the main findings, we found production, revenue, and employment have been severely affected by COVID. 1.5 years into the pandemic, on average, firms have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. Revenue remains 37% below pre-pandemic levels. In terms of employment, on average, firms have 1 employee fewer than the number of employees in February 2020. And women were more impacted by these reductions in employment. Production is still reportedly half of what it was pre-pandemic. The size of the firm affected their likelihood to adopt the use of online sales to cope with the pandemic. So that is, medium firms were more likely to adopt online sales than small firms. And informal borrowing was preferred by businesses in the beginning of the pandemic, and this decreased slightly over time. And from these findings, we can deduce some policy recommendations to boost recovery post-pandemic and shield businesses from future crises. So supporting e-commerce should be pursued as one of the main avenues for sustainable development in Iraq and support of the private sector. Overall, skill-enhancing programs with an emphasis on e-commerce and marketing, among other essential and competitive skills, should be a focus. Specifically, employees laid off during the pandemic should be targeted and prioritized for these programs. Formal capital, such as grants to businesses, should be more quickly available and accessible during crises. And encouraging and supporting the formalization of informal businesses and industries should also be a priority, especially because much of the private sector in Iraq is informal. Right. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Erin and Diego, for this for this presentation, which so it is based on a paper that will be a working paper jointly published with the ERF. I leave the floor to Professor Shahir Zaki for his comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Joris, for the introduction, and thank you, Diego, Irene, and Rafael for this very interesting paper. So I think I have just 5 minutes to give some comments on the presentation and the paper, and then I will send the slides to the organizers in order to send you, some more detailed comments, because I do not have time to present everything. So the paper is very interesting. It includes a wealth of information on the effect of the pandemic on SMEs, and using a new data set, as you have shown, examining different angles on employment, production, gender, which is really informative. A lot of new findings, and especially that it's very recent. So I will mainly classify my comments in 2 parts, some major comments and some minor comments. I'll not present the minor comments. And for the major comments, I'll be mainly talking about 4 main points. So first, the issue of representativeness, then the structure of the paper itself, some further results that might be interesting to add to the paper, and the recommendations. So in terms of the representativeness, it was not very clear in the paper to what extent the sample is representative, because my understanding was that it's part of another sample that was previously that you already had, which is the sample of 2,236 firms. and then the smaller sample that you have is representative for the larger one, but the larger one is itself representative or not. This was not clear in the paper, because if it's not representative, then this means that the smaller sample that you're using is not representative, and in this case, the analysis has to be very cautious about that. And then a second point that was not clear in the paper on the link between the displacement, the regions where we have a lot of displacements, and the choice of SMEs. Because if per se those regions were chosen, then I think it will be difficult to really assess the effect of the pandemic on SMEs, given the fact that from an identification perspective, I know that we're not doing any kind of cause and effect rationale, but this means that those firms are more likely to be vulnerable and fragile, given the fact that these firms are located in regions that are conflict affected or that suffer from a lot of displaced populations. So does this criteria of pre-selection was done on purpose? And if yes, why? And in this case, we have to bear in mind that all these firms, on average, they might be more vulnerable than their counterparts that are not located in areas that are that are less suffering from population displacements. My second comment on the structure, I think it will be interesting or perhaps more informative to revisit a bit the structure of the report or the paper, given that it will be published as a working paper. So I think it will be good to have, after the introduction, a whole section on the socio-economic characteristics, where you include the different background information that is included in different parts that come later in the report. Because as far as I remember, before each section, in gender, in SMEs, in employment, we had a background information section. I think it will be better to gather all these background information section in the socio-economic characteristics, because this section will basically present the structural characteristics of the Iraqi economy. And after this background, we start to examine the effect on SMEs from different perspectives. And then a third section would present the COVID shock itself and the policy response, perhaps add some figures on to what extent the Iraqi response was more or less stringent than other competitor economies in terms of the number of deaths, the number of cases. I mean, just very briefly to locate or to have an idea of the shock itself on the Iraqi economy. And then the fourth section would present the methodology, which you already have in terms of the characteristics of the sample, its representativeness, some very large aggregate descriptive statistics. And then we have a whole section on SMEs that is on the effect, on SMEs, where we have three subsections. One that addresses the effect on employment from different perspectives: job loss, gender, sector, because as far as I remember, employment was addressed in different sections, one on sectors, one on gender, and one on SMEs. But at the end of the day, it's about the employment. So perhaps it will be better to gather all the employment variables in one section, all sales and revenues and performance variables in one section, in general, by governorate or by region. And this will be like a section on firms' performance, and a third section on supply chains and trade, if any, by size, by sector, by governorate, and so on. So this will be like the effect of the pandemic on economic aggregates, which are production, employment, and value chains. And this will be, I think, the storyline will be might be more consistent in this case. And then another section, because it's not really the impact of the pandemic, but it was more on the coping strategies, how firms reacted after the pandemic and how they prepared to future shocks. And I think this has to be included in a different section, including borrowing by formal versus informal firms, the use of e-commerce and use of different technologies, then the preparedness also for future shocks. And then finally, the conclusion with the policy recommendation. I think in this case, we'll be able to distinguish between the shock, its effect, and how firms they reacted. Then perhaps some further results that might be interesting to include in the report or in the paper. I think it's very difficult to assume that that employment can reflect the wealth and the health of the firms, because we can have, a small firm that might have a lot of sales, and in this case, its productivity will be very high. So perhaps in addition to the employment variable that you're using to measure the wealth and health of employment, it's important to add sales in order to calculate productivity, or even if you don't have sales, perhaps the revenues. And in this case, we'll be able to calculate productivity and see how productivity evolved by different characteristics for small firms, for large firms, and for formal versus informal. And this, I think, will be very informative also. Then for coping strategies, it was a bit short in the current version of the paper. So I think it will be interesting to compare how coping strategies were different from a formality status perspective, formal versus informal firms, from the size perspective, how small versus medium versus large firms managed to cope with the pandemic. And finally, even if we have 3% of the firms that have top managers women, it will be also interesting to see how the small share coped compared to male-dominated firms, because this would be an interesting argument, especially in the recommendations when we talk about women empowerment and the gender effects. And I think this comment I already talked about, that the introductory background of each part has to be merged with the socio-economic section that will reflect, or that will include, all the structural characteristics of the Iraqi economy. Finally, on recommendations, I think when it comes to e-commerce, it will be important to highlight the importance of investing in physical and legal infrastructure, because we cannot really have an effective framework of e-commerce without the different laws and regulations that regulate these type of trade, which is sensitive to institutions. And second, in terms of increasing the business capacities to shield themselves when it comes to any forthcoming crisis, it has to be better motivated and perhaps detailed, because how to increase the business capacities to do that, it was not very clear in the recommendation. And finally, on the formalization of the informal sector, I think, and there are some, examples in the literature that show that one of the approaches that help formalize the informal sector is through what we call formalization by promotion, meaning that we do not ask firms to become fully formal, but perhaps we start giving them some loans, even if they are informal firms. And the more the more time passes, the more they will have some credibility between the government and these firms. And then perhaps if they want a bigger loan, then they have perhaps to have a business license. And then if they want to have an even bigger loan, then perhaps or they want to start to export or to import, then perhaps they are asked to have a tax registry, then a business registry, and so on. So the more we promote them and the more we give them more incentives, the more they will have more incentives to become formal firms. And then I have some minor comments on and editorial comments, I would say, but I will share this later with you. So thank you, and great job. Looking forward to the revised version. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zaki, for acknowledging the strengths of the many strengths of the paper, and also suggesting some ways forward for potential future papers. So as I mentioned, we will pursue the discussion and give also an opportunity to Erin and Diego to respond to some of the comments in the discussion at the end of the session. And many thanks also, of course, Erin and Diego for presenting. I now leave the floor to also my colleagues Asfand Wakar and Tassilo Teppert from IOM Libya, who will present a paper that they drafted on the impact of COVID and of conflict on remittances in Libya. Their intervention will be followed directly by a comment from Dr. Georges Nofel, who is the Associate Research Scientist of the Public Policy Research Institute at Texas A&M University. Asfand and Tassilo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Joris, and a very warm welcome to the audience. Asfand and myself will be walking you over the next 50 minutes or so through migrant remittances during armed conflict and pandemic in Libya. Both of us have been working for IOM Libya's office in Tripoli. And without further ado, I say let's jump straight into it, and we can go to the first slide. Now, perhaps before going into the actual content methodologies, perhaps just a few brief words to add a little bit of context. I mean, of course, migration in Libya is probably a 5-hour webinar in itself, but we'll just put a few points of reference here. So the first one being that it's good to remember that Libya has traditionally been a country of destination for migrant workers. So if we go back in time to before 2011, before the fall of the Gaddafi regime, Libya had a quite substantial migrant population of estimated back then around 2.5 million, which compared to a Libyan host population of less than 7 million people is quite substantial. Now, fast forwarding 10 years to 2021, the latest estimates put the number of migrants present in Libya at around 610,000. So while substantially lower, this is quite a significant migrant population, as you can see here on this slide, from at least 44 countries of origin. But also here, again, an important point of context, approximately two-thirds of those actually come from Libya's neighboring countries. Now, I'm mentioning this because, depending on, where our different listeners and audience may be in, a lot of the media narrative often focuses on transit migration, but it's good to keep in mind that, despite the conflict, despite all the challenges Libya has been going through over the past 10 years, it still attracts migrant workers, given the quite higher salaries compared to other countries in the region. After all, Libya remains an oil extracting country, and just putting this here just to perhaps keep it in the back of our minds as we go through the presentation on remittances. Now, we're looking here in the presentation and at the paper that Joris already mentioned, particularly at the period of 2019 and 2020. So as many may know, in April 2019, conflict broke out in Libya, and then in 2020, while the conflict was still in full effect, on top of that, the country was grappling with the pandemic like pretty much all other countries around the world. Now, when we go to the next slide, as we're slowly moving a little bit to what we did and what came out of it, perhaps also to mention that the data was primarily collected by IOM Libya with the aim of facilitating evidence-based interventions, both, let's say, on the humanitarian side, but also at policy level, and particularly related to migration management. So all of what you're seeing here has been conducted through surveys with migrants through IOM Libya's displacement tracking matrix, and these were pretty much all face-to-face interviews. Now, as we're moving towards a deep dive into the data itself, also to mention that the data was collected, as I mentioned, through a face-to-face migrant survey. Now, this is a modular survey, so we have different thematic modules, one of them being on remittances. So all the data that we're looking at is actually self-reported from migrants. So we're not looking at banking data, we're really looking at self-reported remittances data from migrants, recipients of these remittances, use of remittances in home countries, and also importantly, modalities of transaction and transfers, which is again also when we're talking about self-reported data, important to keep in mind that the vast majority of migrants in Libya are completely unbanked. Also, Libya's banking system has, also for the host population, severe liquidity constraints. Through most of the reporting period here, we had around more than 300% gap between official exchange rate and black market exchange rate between dinar and dollar. So, just again, adding a few points of context to a little bit, frame on why this was done the way it was done and situate the findings a little bit. Now, we have a quite substantial sample size of over 41,000 migrants who were surveyed in 2019-2020 in all 22 administrative regions of Libya. Now, as you can see here, 83%, so that's more than 4 out of 5 respondents reported intentions of sending remittances home from Libya. And at the time of the survey, around a third of those had already done so. Now, as we've looked a little bit now here at the context, a little bit of analytical background and approach to our data collection, we'll now dive into the actual data on remittances in 2019-2020. Now, you can see here the time chart. So what you're seeing here is the percentage of migrants who responded sending home remittances. Now, when we look at here the left-hand side, January 2019, we had a close to 50% of the surveyed migrants reporting successfully sending remittances. And then you see here the two main events that occurred during these 2 years was in 2019 in April, the start of the armed conflict in Western Libya, as well as to a lesser extent also in southern Libya, and we see immediately a quite substantial drop over the coming months, owing to the ramifications of conflict on the Libyan economy, especially as the conflict was centered in Tripoli, which is not only the capital but also the one of the key economic hub in Libya, both for Libyans as well as for migrant workers. So we see here as we go through time quite a substantial drop from 50% or close to 50% at the start of the conflict to 25% only a few months later. Now, as we go on over time, we see, as this bounces back slightly, but not to the same levels as before. And then when the pandemic kicked in, we see the second valley there. And again, especially in the first few months of the pandemic, lockdowns, companies being not being able to operate the way they were operating before, and so on. Perhaps, also as we're looking at, as we're trying to situate this a little bit, of course, on the flip side also is that still despite these challenges, if we're talking a little, glass half full, glass half empty, we still see that despite all of these challenges, quite a substantial amount of migrants in Libya still managed to successfully send home remittances. Now, also apart from the proportion of migrants dropping in terms of being able to remit, we also see a drop in the value of remittances of those still being able to do so. So we see here in 2019 an average of around 146 USD per month, dropping to 123 in 2020. So this is should be around, I guess, 15%. So both proportion as well as amounts have been going down quite substantially. And I think on that note, Asfan, I'll pass it over to you to walk our audience through the remittances and migrant skill levels.
Thank you, Tassilo, and hi, everyone. So as Tassilo just mentioned, we collected a range of data on remittances by migrants from Libya. Some of the indicators that he also mentioned, already mentioned, apart from the percentage of migrants reporting successfully sending remittances and the value of the remittances that they were able to send, we also measured a lot of other indicators, for example, on demography, migrants' occupations, their educational levels. And as you see in this one chart, to demonstrate the benefit of having collected this data prior to the events and then making connections with the events as Tassilo just did. We also measured that occupations in which migrants were employed, if we plot them based on the international standard classification of occupations and the required skill levels for all these occupations, we see that migrants employed in occupations that require higher skill levels were able to send higher amounts, values of remittances. That's what this complicated looking chart is demonstrating. So if we look at it, migrants with higher skill levels 4 that are mostly in managerial kind of positions were emitting per month values of 37% of them were emitting per month value of $300 or more. And then if you see the trend, it kind of declines along with the skill levels. Skill level 3 and 4 with the mid management and the kind of skills that require a bit of decision making and a bit of analytical skills, the percentage of migrants sending remittances then goes towards smaller values. The high percentage of migrants were sending less and less values. For instance, majority of them were then below 100, between 101 and lower values, between 200 and 101 and lower values. Similarly, if you go towards the lowest skill level, you see that the larger chunk of migrants at skill level 1, which requires more physical activity and less of analytical skills, were sending largely amounts that were below $200. The vast majority of migrants, up to 75%, were sending less than $100 per month. This just gives an idea of the kind of labor market that exists in Libya. As it does in in a lot of other countries, the remittances follow the kind of employment opportunities and skill levels and education levels that migrants bring with them to this employment market. Beyond that, also, as you heard in the brief context from Tassilo on the migration itself to Libya, we also hold remittances in the context of migration to Libya as playing a central role based on our analysis of the migrants' motivations for migration, being largely based on the fact that they find increased opportunities for employment in Libya, and they are able to increase their individual and household level incomes and diversify their sources of incomes by migrating to Libya. Remittances play a central role in this. And that's why we assume, based on our analysis, that these remittances are linked with increased capacities, and also therefore within Libya and for their households back in their countries of origin are linked with reduced vulnerabilities as well. However, as you already saw the timeline, that there was a decrease in remittances over the course of these events, which means, because of the armed conflict and because of the pandemic, an increased number of migrants were facing difficulties and, reduced capacities to make earning. Furthermore, by the end of the 2020, we also, in a direct interview with migrants, were also able to identify that 47% of the migrants clearly reported that their ability to send remittances home was reduced because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is because of the reduction in earnings due to the socio-economic impact of COVID-19. And also we were in the same time measuring a decline in migrants' employment, which was shown in the form of increased unemployment in migrants. We also collected data on a range of other indicators, so we are able to check and dip in, reduction in my remittances was there simultaneously along with the increased food insecurity reported amongst migrants. So that's also kind of a confirmation of the fact that remittances are linked with the increased capacities, and as migrants are facing challenges to set remittances, they're also facing challenges to meet their other basic needs. Wrapping all of this up, as this data collection was already planned before armed conflict and before COVID-19 pandemic, so none of that was anticipated. This is just the side effect of having a data collection in a continuous manner that ends up catching these events. The reductions that we saw there were measured just along the course of it. What we saw in the start of 2020 was that there was a prediction in global global decline in remittances during 2021. By mid 2021, these trends were revised, and there was a actual measurement that the global remittances are not declining as was expected, but things were better off than initially was feared. However, in Libya, we do see that the remittances are not catching up. They have remained slow. Similarly, we have seen a slight improvement over 2020 employment levels of migrants. So for example, in 2020, the unemployment of migrants fell down to 27%. In 2021, it has came up to 20%, but the pre-pandemic level of 17% have still not been met, which shows that the vulnerabilities still remain. Lastly, if I just catch up on the point that Tassilo made, that from $146 per month to $123 per month in 2019, 15% decline. Our July to September 2021 figure of migrant remittances stood at $96 per month, which shows that while remittances are being sent, their value and the number of migrants sending remittances is still low. Just to wrap it up, I see that we are at the end of our time slot as well. We will continue to collect this data along with the other indicators, which will continue to assess the situation of migrants in Libya. However, there is an increasing discussion on the fact that while we do look at the remittance of migrants as a positive indicator, what we often miss, and that is something we are addressing in 2021, is the conditions in which migrants have to live and their social costs of being able to send these remittances for their families back home. While we measure remittances, we see the positive aspects of it, but we don't often measure the conditions that migrants live in and endure to be able to send these remittances. So we are aware of these facts as well, and as we continue with this data collection, we will incorporate more of these other aspects. With thanks on that, open to discussions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asfand and Tassilo for this presentation and another strong and interesting presentation. I leave the floor directly to Dr. Georges Nofel for your comment. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity to review this paper and to be part of this very interesting workshop. So I have a few comments that I'm going to discuss here, and then I'll gladly also send these with other comments on the paper to the authors. So this is a very interesting paper. I mean, it provides a description from a country that offers a unique opportunity. I mean, you're looking at two things happening here. I mean, you're looking at conflict, and that conflict is not stagnant. Lots of variation in movement, lots of local shocks. And also you're looking at a worldwide shock, which is the pandemic. Given this, displacement tracking matrix and, allows you a data set that, provides opportunities to examine the remittance flow. So this is, from a reader's perspective, very interesting and offer a lot of opportunities to study this moving forward. With that said, I think the paper would benefit from a few additions to kind of mainly organize and clarify some of the arguments presented. I want to, just jump in and say the paper was a little bit short, and I'm not sure if this was more of a note or if there is room to expand. And if there is room to expand, then we can definitely, go through some of the suggestions that follow. Perhaps, as a reader who's maybe not familiar with the context, give a brief historical background to migration remittances in the Libyan context, and then kind of place Libya in terms of where does it stand worldwide in terms of a migration destination. The paper does mention, there is, I think, one sentence about this and a reference, but perhaps more information, where do they, migrants come from, how have remittance flows historically been? What type of migration are we talking about? Is this mainly a short contract migration, or is it long-term? How many years do migrants typically stay, length of stay, stuff like that? And I know the paper does allude to it, and in the presentation today was clearly mentioned that most of the migrants come from neighboring countries. And I think that's kind of important to clearly, start the paper with. And then also, I think with that said, another summary of the political turmoil / armed conflict and the impact on the economic activities in Libya will also help the reader put things into context. What sectors were the most affected? I mean, I know the paper mentions migrants work in construction sectors, agriculture, and so on and so forth. Were these affected? By how much? Or this will allow the reader to understand where Libya stands in terms of destination as a migration destination, and also how the recent armed conflict has affected some of those incentives and opportunities to come and move to Libya. Something else that is also important, and I know the paper does send the reader to multiple references, but I think it would be good to kind of present what the data matrix is. And this doesn't have to go into really a lot of details, but just a brief introduction. Method of collection, I know it was self-reported, but sample selection, what were the modules or list of questions, what's the target population, geographical distribution. I mean, because that is important whenever you want to also link it to conflict. The design, what were the information collected? For instance, do you know about length of stay? Do you also have data before January 2019? It wasn't clear in the paper to some of those main concepts, and I think that's important. That allows the paper to be a good, strong reference for future research, which is what the paper actually ended, with a clear message to, we're going to do a lot more with the data. And I think that's a very good thing. And also, whenever you think about those two main events, the armed conflict and the pandemic, I mean, you may want to separate them to a certain extent. These are very different shocks. One is more local. One maybe varies and moves a lot. And the other one affects not just Libya, but also others, the countries of origin, basically, of the migrants. And maybe also here, just like a brief summary of the conflict, a brief summary of historical migration, maybe perhaps how did the pandemic affect Libya? What were kind of lockdowns in terms of, what happened in terms of all of this local policies? This gives also an idea about things that could affect a movement and, of people and also money. A few statements in the paper were not very clear, and actually, when I say not very clear, it means it opened more questions to me, and I hope the paper would consider maybe expanding on these. For instance, I mean, I kind of only list 3 here, but it says unemployment rate among migrants was higher in their country of origin than in Libya, which I think it makes sense. Can you be unemployed migrant in Libya and stay? If you had lower unemployment, back in the country of origin, maybe you wouldn't consider coming to Libya. But also, interestingly, and that's the second one is very, very interesting for me, that remittances is not the primary source of income, and it's more of a diversification. I thought that's really perhaps different from other types of migration destination, and maybe this is something the research team should consider looking more into in the future. Although, the paper does end by saying, understanding migration and livelihood in Libya for migrants is critical to send money. But at the same time, the remittance is not a primary source of income. It's more of a diversification. Very interesting information. I think something that definitely should be looked more into. And then when we look at the summary and the conclusion, I want the paper to say, what's the really main point here? I think the main point should be, this is a description of historical background of migration to a country that is an important destination for migrants. Number 2, a country that has really unique opportunities, conflict and obviously pandemic. Number 3, a country that has this data that is rich, that is being built up. So these are opportunities to further study, migration, remittances, but also livelihoods of migrants in Libya. So I think that's what the main key message from the paper. And at the end, and I'll share that with the authors, I have a few comments on perhaps moving some of the organization of the paper to kind of add more subheadings and sections to allow basically an easier flow of information based on some of the comments that I just made. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoy reading the paper. I look forward to reading another version of it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nofel, for this, and thanks again to the presenters Tassilo and Asfand for their presentations. I want to move, maybe bearing time in mind, I would like to move directly to our next presentation, which will be made by so Dr. Bilal Malaib from the World Bank and Mr. Alex Tyler from UNHCR. So it's the third and final presentation, and their presentation is called Compounding Misfortunes, Changes in Poverty Since the Onset of the Pandemic on Syria Refugees and Host Communities in Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon. And their presentation will be followed by a comment from Professor Jad Shaban from INSEAD and Université Paris-Dauphine. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My name's Alex Tyler. I think my video shows me as Bilal, but I'll take that as a compliment to me. Right? I'm sure it's not the other way around. But I'm working with UNHCR in the Middle East North Africa Bureau. The study, which Bilal is the main author and the main driver behind the study, I mean, Bilal will present, came from coming together with the World Bank and UNHCR already back from March 2020 in the context of COVID hitting us all globally, but particularly vulnerable populations in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. We wanted to know, there was a lot of data being collected by all of our different organizations. There was a lot of studies being made. We wanted to really drill down and understand how COVID, and particularly the lockdowns and the necessary restrictions on freedom of movement, could affect the poverty of particularly vulnerable groups, including host communities, Iraqis, Jordanians, Lebanese, and the Syrian refugees who are hosting them. Noting, of course, that many of the Syrian refugees, particularly in Lebanon, were already, the vast majority are living below the poverty line, even before the crisis hit. Now, the study was kind of framed around the different Brussels conferences. There were these quite high-level Brussels conferences, the fourth one in 2020 and the fifth one in March 2021, which are these high-level coming together of different stakeholders around the Syria crisis to see what can be done to support Syria and the countries hosting Syrian refugees in the region. We did an initial side event presenting some of the initial findings back in mid-2020, which then resulted in the final report being released in December 2020, entitled Compounding Misfortunes. But then already in early 2021, I mean, WFP is a regular partner of all of ours. And we came together with WFP, the World Bank and UNHCR, shared data around both the impact of COVID, but also what we're trying to do through cash programming to mitigate the impact of COVID in terms of reducing poverty and strengthening people's capacity to cope. And that resulted in a sort of an update issued in March 2021, where a lot of the findings were confirmed, or there were further details which could be extrapolated from the greater data set now that WFP had joined us in that final joint product. I won't go on much further, except I'll just hand over to Bilal, who can the methodology and the findings. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to IOM for organizing this conference and ERF. It's always a pleasure to be back at ERF, even if it's virtually. Let me pick up on where Alex left off. So this report is a series of attempts to simulate what poverty may look like after the onset of COVID-19. And the challenge here started with the fact that with the pandemic and the difficulty in carrying out household budget surveys, particularly in person, the ability to collect data on consumption and therefore measure poverty was rather challenging. And so the idea came about with UNHCR initially to say, okay, well, what do we know about these refugees and host communities before COVID? What do we know about the effects of the pandemic on the macroeconomy, on remittances, on the various inputs that feed into the household welfare function? And what can we infer about the evolution of poverty across the months after the onset of the pandemic? Now, as you can imagine, this relies on a number of macro estimates or predictions at the time, which were volatile. And we've just heard from colleagues in IOM that even also projections on remittances were continuously being revised. And so therefore, this is a continuous effort. Even right now, a new team is actually in place to continue some of the work that we've started and see how to refine this analysis. And I'll show you some of those considerations later. So not to repeat, the idea was that we model the changes in poverty through the various inputs, and we also tried to model the effects or the mitigation effects of certain cash transfers or the programs that were rolled out in response to COVID, and see how much of the poverty increases were mitigated. So we know that when the COVID pandemic hit, there was a strong and stringent response in terms of lockdowns and restriction on movements in the early days of the pandemic. In some countries, this carried on for a number of months and then was relaxed and then picked up again. In others, it was more of a kind of a peaks and troughs in terms of the strictness of these measures. You can see in Jordan, it was very strict in the early days, and then it dropped and then went back up and then dropped again. For Iraq, it sustained a strict restriction of movement for a number of months, and then relaxed it and then picked it up again. And in Lebanon, it was high. It was lower peaks than the other countries, but it was going up and down in response to the crisis. Now, of course, these were necessary measures to respond to the health crisis, but they did, as one would expect, have some consequences on the economy, and we've all felt that. Now, the first choice we had to make was what kind of data we can use for this analysis. Ideally, one would have used national household surveys that would reflect or correspond to the national poverty measures. And this was the first obstacle. The national surveys were only available in Iraq for the years shortly pre-pandemic era. But in Jordan, the latest data was not publicly available. And for Lebanon, the latest data is 2012, which is 1, outdated, and 2, not publicly available. So we decided to use a survey that was conducted by a team at the World Bank in 2015-16. This is the Syrian Refugee and Host Community Surveys, SRHCS. And it covers Lebanon, 3 governorates of Jordan, and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. The reason we use this, not because it is nationally representative, it is in Lebanon, but in Jordan, it represents 3 regions. In Iraq, it represents the Kurdistan region. But we use it because it uses a comparable instrument across the 3 countries, and it also includes both refugees and host communities, making it comparable within the hosts and refugees in each country and across countries for that matter. Now, in today's presentation, I'll be showing results of Lebanon and KRI because the macro estimates of Jordan are continuously being revised, and in the future release of the new predictions of these models, updated data from Jordan will be available. So what is the simulation framework that we relied on? Well, we looked at the macroeconomic shocks, and these were the impact on the various economic activities or the sectors. We looked at the impact of remittances, making assumptions on what it would have been in 2020 and 2021. And clearly, as we've just heard from our colleagues in IOM, these assumptions on or predictions on the changes in remittances are also being revised, and they will feed into updated models. We also saw changes in government or UN or stakeholder assistance to migrants, to refugees, and the host communities. Clearly, there were impacts on prices and inflation. And we made assumptions on the economic recovery path. We did that in the first report, and then we revised those in the second report based on data that kept coming in. So we relied on households' characteristics pre-COVID, namely the sectors of work and whether they are in the formal or informal sector. We also looked at the sources of income that they relied on, whether they were in wage workers, whether they were self-employed or own account workers, whether they relied on remittances, transfers, or others. And so for each sector, we took the macroeconomic shock. These were at the quarterly level, were available. They were smooth or assuming a linear trend across months. And for each month, we assumed this would translate into a loss of income for the worker in that particular sector, adjusting for informality. And where households do not have wage work or are in self-employment, we also modeled remittances and transfers. And where they had all the model combined all these inputs together. The results were shown in the paper at the international poverty line and the national poverty line. Here I'm going to present the international poverty line numbers for brevity. Clearly, the effects that we're showing here are also not just COVID, right? So if we think about Lebanon, and this is also inspired by the title of the study, the compounding misfortunes, there are so many compounded crises that arrived at the same time in Lebanon. There was COVID, there was the economic and financial crisis, there was the Port of Beirut blast, and there's a continuing crisis up until today. So going back to the pre-COVID data, we looked at the sectors of work in which these workers were in. So in Lebanon, most people were in most Lebanese people were in wholesale and trade, education, administrative services, banking, and others. While for Syrian refugees, they were mostly in construction, agriculture, and wholesale and trade. So similar trends we see in terms of sectors of work in the self-employed among the self-employed people, where most people were in wholesale and trade. Refugees, Syrian refugees, were mostly in construction and manufacturing. For Iraq, for KRI in particular, the hosts were mainly in public administration when it came to the wage workers, and in transport and wholesale and retail. Syrians were mainly in the construction sector, the wholesale and retail, and internally displaced populations, which we do observe in the data in Iraq, in KRI, where in the construction or public works sector, and in transport and retail. So this is a snapshot of what things looked like before the crisis, before the pandemic. You can visibly see in the red line that the Syrian refugees were poorer even at baseline than the host community, and similarly in KRI, refugees and IDPs. Unlike in Jordan and Lebanon, in KRI, refugees, IDPs, and the host communities shared similar initial poverty rates. So we saw also here a different starting point for each of these different groups. As I mentioned, for Lebanon, the results are compounded by a number of crises, including the financial and economic meltdown, as well as the COVID effects and the Port of Beirut blast. So here in Lebanon, compared to the first initial estimates, we had revised the pass-through of GDP growth into income, which was estimated at 50% for 2020 and 75% for 2021. This is the ratio of private consumption to GDP. We also ran some counterfactual estimates in case the full level of inflation pass-through into consumption may be reduced by substitution effects, for example, by consuming locally produced goods, and changes in consumption behaviors and patterns. However, based on the food inflation trends up until March 2021 and continuing until today, the proportion of the food share as a proportion of households' consumption basket suggests that actually the overall CPI, which we're seeing in this picture, may be a lower bound, because at the food price inflation, the food price inflation is considerably higher than the overall inflation. So what do we see in terms of results? We see in Lebanon, among the Lebanese population, there is an increase. These are changes from baseline. They do not show. These are not levels of poverty. These are changes from what they started out on. So for the Lebanese population, the 13 percentage point increase by end of 2020, and 28 percentage point increase by the end of 2021. These are at the international poverty line. You'll see different estimates at the national poverty line. For the Syrian refugees, there's a 39 percentage point increase by the end of 2020, and a 52 percentage point increase by end of 2021. There's some mitigation efforts, which include the cash transfers by UNHCR and WFP programs for refugees in Lebanon. But given the magnitude of price inflation, the effects of these mitigation measures had limited effects. In the case of Lebanon in particular, here the impact of cash assistance, as cited by the partner organizations in the study, where the limited effect of the cash transfers was motivated by the soaring levels of inflation and the constant increase in the minimum expenditure basket's absolute value was not met by the adjustment in assistance to refugees. The low official exchange rate, which does not reflect the actual market value of the Lebanese currency, meant that the development and humanitarian community was losing some of the donor money that they were receiving. This had changed since then, as far as I'm aware, but at the time that this study was carried out, those were the cited reasons. Clearly, when we look at food price inflation, we see a much larger increase in poverty, and this is a quick snapshot to show that when we model the effects of the food price inflation, the increase is much more severe. So there's an increase of around 47 percentage points in poverty by end of 2021 for the Lebanese population, and about 68 percentage point increase by end of 2021 for the Syrians. These are not definitive numbers, as you can imagine, but we're trying to show the range at which these effects may be falling. So for Lebanon, the main motivating factor behind the increase in poverty is price inflation, which of course we can talk about its root causes and consequences separately. But in terms of how poverty has, what shaped poverty increases over the past month as a direct effect was through prices and obviously changes in employment, which are not modeled in this framework. For KRI, what we see is that for the residents, for the host community, there was a 14 percentage point increase in poverty by the end of 2020, and by the end of 2021, this was at around 15 percentage points. So no recovery, despite in the first edition of this study, there was an expectation of recovery, but this did not materialize. For refugees, the increase by end of 2020 was around 16 percentage point and flattened out by the end of 2021 with very limited drop in poverty. And for IDPs, it's estimated to have been around 17 percentage point by 2020 and 16 percentage point by end of 2021 compared to the baseline. And these again were increases in poverty. So to wrap it up, First, in terms of caveats, this simulation is clearly far from perfect. There's many areas that the team is exploring to improve on these initial results and on the model itself. So, for instance, currently the employment changes are modeled in terms of income losses, which correspond to drop in to the drops in sectoral GDPs or output. But in fact, one can think of employment changes to be also non-income changes, whereby some of the more vulnerable workers may have dropped, may have lost all of their income, and some of the less vulnerable workers may have had a lower decrease or change in their income levels, which means that the vulnerable workers may have seen may have witnessed a more severe effect than currently modeled. So we can think of these as a lower bound. We also, in Lebanon, the crisis is constantly emerging, and the results may need to be fine-tuned. And obviously, we're not looking here at the gender differences in the impact of COVID, which I understand the team is also going to be looking into it in further revisions. So to recap, this update or this study uses macroeconomic data at the sectoral levels and predictions on the evolution of the economy, including some inputs on remittances and social assistance in mitigating the effects of COVID-19. We presented here the results for Lebanon and KRI. The results of Jordan are yet to be updated. What we see is that in Lebanon, the estimates suggest that the number of poor people may have increased by as many as 1.5 million Lebanese individuals, and I do think this might be a lower bound estimate, and around 800,000 Syrian refugees. These are at the international poverty line. And for the KRI region, the recovery trajectory was revised, and a linear trend on growth was assumed for 2021. And the estimates suggest that there was around 738,000 people increase in among the host community in terms of poverty, and 88,000 refugees and 28,000 internally displaced population. So as further data becomes available, and indeed, further data has become available both from the phone surveys carried out by colleagues at the World Bank, but also in partner organizations, IOM, WFP, UNHCR, and many others, the ILO. The study and the assumptions and the inputs into these models will be fine-tuned to get a clearer picture of the poverty trends, and to look a little bit into the differential effects by various groups within these two general populations. With that, I thank you all, and I look forward for comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bilal, for your presentation, and also Alex for the introduction. I leave the floor directly to Professor Jad Shaban for the comment. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me? I had some issues with the. All right. So thank you for the presentation. I also had the opportunity to read the report that was shared also on, which I think is the basis of this work. First, I have to say that it is always important to, estimate the impact of crisis on the most vulnerable communities. And for this, the present work is valuable. However, I have some serious concerns with the objectives of the work, and also the methodology and the end results, which I would like to share, in hoping that the authors can improve this work, which is important. And I'll start actually with the end, with the end result. We see estimates of number of people who are thrown into poverty, final estimates, which, yes, I mean, the authors say that these are estimates, there are some limitations. However, this is extremely dangerous to throw numbers like this, because this has programmatic implications. This has implications on budgets. This has implications on country strategy. So one should be very careful when providing estimates like this, actual figures, because I know, for having worked more than now, 10 years on the refugee crisis in the region, and having worked with a lot of agencies, and including UNHCR, that handle programming of cash assistance, for instance, having numbers out there is very tricky for us researchers and policy and analysts, if you want. So I would caution first that whenever numbers like these are presented, that there at least be a margin, of error and some interval, and not throwing numbers like this. And I'll come back to why. That's my first concern. And my second concern is, what is the objective of a macro-micro simulation and its value added, given that you can always invest in cross-section repeated surveys, which have been done, particularly in Lebanon on the refugee community, and more recently there are ideas about doing it for the Lebanese population, that estimates poverty, over time, and have a retrospective analysis of the contributors to the poverty evolution. So that kind of analysis historically has given us very accurate analysis of the Syrian refugee population in Lebanon. And unfortunately, it has not been done for the Lebanese. So what is the value added of a macro-micro simulation that wants to show the impact of COVID and other crises on vulnerable communities in these countries? I think the only objective that makes it stand, its ground compared to repeated cross-section surveys is to show that alternative policy implications of, for instance, increasing or facilitating remittances, or fighting inflation, or making sure that cash programs are increased, or having more access to work, will have different implications of poverty. And this would be interesting, but this has not been presented in this paper yet. I hope this can be explored. So that's on the objective component. And then, why am I saying this? Because the model itself stands on very shaky assumptions, to say the least, and very questionable assumptions in the analysis itself, which makes us wonder, why do you want to compare different settings in the beginning and different populations? The Lebanese population is different from the refugee population. The Syrian refugee population is different from the Bekaa to the Akkar to the south. There's a lot of geographic variation. The Lebanese and Syrians in Lebanon are different from the Iraqis, and they're completely different from the Jordanians. So what's the value added of cross-country comparison in a setting of informality and specificities of each society and each economy that makes these comparisons futile, in my opinion? One should have particular case studies of each and every population and simulate the implications on each and every single set of population, and in my opinion, go more geographic detail also, show us results on governorate level. And this joins then the survey tool used to simulate all of this, which is the survey done, the income survey done by the bank in 2015. First, there is no discussion in the paper that how is the survey still relevant 6 years after? What has been done to make it still relevant? One. Second, and this is one of the key drawbacks of this work, is that you have income data which are, we know, always underreported in household surveys, and you do a transformation of this income data into consumption aggregates using scaling factors. And frankly, this would not pass any serious academic review. I'm sorry to say this, because we know that consumption is different than income in terms of smoothing, in terms of saving. You say in your paper that you rule out saving behavior. This is not true. If you read the Vazir studies, all of the studies, there are some savings, but also there are a lot of negative saving. There's a lot of debt involved. So we can't really transform income into consumption. That's the first problem. Second, what about real consumption? Because, in poverty studies, you handle real consumption, not nominal consumption. And the second assumption used when you simulate the shocks is that you only simulate shocks to income sources. You don't simulate shocks to the pricing level. And in Lebanon, the real changes in welfare is what mattered, not the nominal ones. And not only through income, through the real purchasing power that declined. Then there are other assumptions that you say that there are no behavioral responses from household to the shocks. Again, this is not true. Vazir shows 2020 that there's a change in food consumption and a change in increased debt and other changes. So households, especially poor households, actually do have behavioral changes when they're confronted with crisis, and this cannot be ruled out in any microsimulation anymore. Then you also simulate informality shocks as a percentage of formal economy shocks, and you set it at 20%. Why? What is the basis for this? Since we know that most economies and most refugee systems are informal, we can't just flat out and say, well, the shock will translate 20% in the informal sectors as a percentage of the formal sectors. There's no basis for that. I mean, I didn't see any basis for this assumption. Then there's a problem in the assistance level modeling. So you also assume that assistance is randomly assigned within deciles. Again, because you use one tool and you want to customize it across countries, this has serious drawbacks on the your ability to use particular surveys and then simulate on each survey the assistant level and the proper changes within it and the behavioral changes that might happen. So I strongly advise against that. I mean, why would you assume random distribution of assistance while we know that there are the proxy means tested programs, particularly for the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and now recently that there's talk about the Lebanese population. And finally, there is a problem again on the lack of geographical focus, which I would suggest, hopefully in a better version of this work, that you actually separate the simulations on geographic, on governorate basis. As much as you can go micro is much better, because the Bekaa economy is different from the Akkar economy, is different from, and we're talking just Lebanon. Imagine if you want to compare across other areas. So just to conclude, I think the value added of macro simulations in your work is to show that for each particular population, we can have different sources of shocks and then have different recommendations, but for each population on its own, and then use tools that are separate, survey tools that are, use the Vazir for the Syrians, use the updated 2018 survey for Lebanon, which you can impute. The labor survey that was done has better income data, if you want, than the older survey. The same for Jordan, same for Iraq, and then here you can expand on other countries. But I don't see any value in lumping together one survey tool that is outdated, doing a lot of assumptions on it, both macro and micro, to just show us that there is a business cycle impact on poverty. Yes, we know this. Of course, we know this. And then to produce figures of poverty numbers, I think this is the most dangerous. And I would strongly recommend against that because of the possible policy implications. And lastly, sorry if I took a bit longer, if your work then is about COVID, then COVID is not, the economic shock because of COVID is not only disruption to income. COVID has a mortality impact, morbidity impact, healthcare utilization impact. So if you want to then turn your work into the COVID implications on refugees, then, the economic shocks are beyond income. And here you can use household surveys to remove, let's say, breadwinner in the household, simulate the loss of the household head, loss of income, and the like. I'll stop here. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to discuss this work.
Thank you very much for your comment, and I'm sorry to be the one who says that. So officially our session should end now, and I see very much how this could lead to long and lively debates. I suggest that we maybe, if participants agree, have answers from the presenters to their commenters, but we shouldn't go after, I mean, more than 6-7 minutes. So Diego, would you like maybe to go first, very briefly, if you want to answer to any of your comments, and then we can go to Tassilo and Asfan and also Bilal and Alex if there is time. Diego, can you hear us? Okay. In the meantime, maybe Asfan and Tassilo, you would like to take the floor to make any further comments or any last points?
Thank you, Joris. No, just wanted to thank Professor Naufel and also perhaps highlight that we do have a bit in-depth report on the remittances sent by migrants from Libya. And perhaps if I am allowed, I'll share that in the links. And yeah, I mean, I do understand that we kept the paper for this a bit brief, and all the questions raised by Professor Georges Naufel, they're very good and very useful, and we will use them for our future studies as well. It's just that the paper we wrote for this purpose was a bit of an extract from the larger study, but I will plug in the larger study in the comments. And thank you so much for the constructive criticism and feedback. It's really useful for us to improve. I think that's it from our side.
Thank you very much, Asfan. Diego, are you back with us? Okay, so in that case, if Alex and Bilal want to say any last any final words to the event, you're most welcome.
Alex, maybe I'll just respond to some of the technical questions first, and I will leave the objective setting and the value of the study to you as the architects of this work. No, I thank you first, Jad, for the comments. I think these are very good thoughts on the limitations of the study, and to a certain extent questioning whether it should have been done to start with. I think maybe one of the things that I would, now I think it's a paradigm between having some data or no data. I think this was the starting point of why this analysis came about, and Alex can tell us a bit more. Now, why didn't we do repeated cross sections? Well, during COVID, it was impossible to do these face-to-face surveys, and the phone surveys would not, by any stretch, be able to capture the full extent of household consumption and in order to measure poverty. Now, one can ask, why do we need to measure poverty at that frequency? That's also a fair question, and it is to a certain extent subjective. In terms of the specificity of each country, the results were calibrated, or the inputs, the assumptions were calibrated to the specificity of each country, and where they weren't, the report was very clear on its shortcomings. Again, here the question, if I understand your points correctly, was, well, if you think that some of these assumptions are incomplete or lacking a certain level of accuracy, then why do you predict poverty numbers? I think the prediction of poverty numbers was specifically for programmatic reasons, and Alex could elaborate on that, given that the programmatic implications are largely for UNHCR. And then there are a number of assumptions that are in place. The fact is, at least for Lebanon, this is the case. For Jordan and Iraq, they are actually backed up by existing surveys and data. But for Lebanon, the lack of actual official data makes it difficult to estimate some of the differential effects, let's say on informality or formality. The last household budget survey, you mentioned the 2018 data, which does not actually include the consumption module. The last consumption module in Lebanon is 2012. So everything had to be calibrated. Everything was projected in real terms, now casted to the beginning of the COVID crisis, and then modeled throughout the crisis. Again, I started my presentation by saying this is by no means a perfect model. It's an attempt to see how the effects of COVID would have fared in these three countries and how different they would have been for the host community and the refugee community. But I don't think the report was making claims larger than that. But again, thank you so much for the valuable comments, and I'm sure the team will take it into consideration going forward. Alex?
Yes, and I think we appreciate the comments, Professor, and I think your comments actually warrant a whole seminar in itself to go through, and perhaps that's something we could discuss outside of this as well, so to give more time to the presenters here. But I mean, look, we did link this directly to informing program and policy. So the timing of the results and specifically the technical meetings which we held at each country level with different government officials, UN NGO workers, including the cash working groups and basic needs working groups. You know, there are different groups in each country. Was specifically timed for around October, November, in order to inform the next cycle of planning and budgeting into the next year. There was so that was the explicit purpose. I mean, whilst at the same time, I think, given the time frame and the fact that we were using existing data into this model rather than, as you suggested, alternative data collection methodologies, that it had to be put into place between May and November in order to hit that point of helping to contribute to along the collective knowledge of, and therefore inform the planning into 2021 at that stage. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think that Bilal has, I won't comment further on the methodologies. We feel comfortable with it in order to meet that purpose I just described, as well as whilst being aware of the limitations of the study and the methodology and how it's collected. But look, I mean, we are all for improving this, and I think certainly we would very much appreciate further discussions with you on how to pick this up, you know, as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both for your response, and I hate to be the one saying this, but the session is now almost over. And looking at also your response, Bilal and Alex, I think that Bilal, you mentioned the point that is very valid, that to some extent sometimes you have to choose between no data at all and data that is imperfect, and this is a point that all organizations face to some extent. What is sure is that there is a need for more data and more, I mean, from all our sides, all organizations, and I'm speaking for all organizations, for more data and more qualitative data also. And also there is a need to avail this, to ensure that this information is available and accessible to all. And that was the idea that led us to organize this webinar series. Before closing, I would like to thank very much all of the speakers today and the commentators for their kind contribution and their hard work. I also thank the participants and the attendees for their interest and their time. Tomorrow we have a third session of our webinar, which will focus on social protection in the context of COVID-19. So I hope to see as many of you as possible in that session tomorrow. Have a good evening, and yes, hopefully I'll see as many of you connected as possible. Thank you so much for everything. Goodbye.